Mandy and Yoad, are you ready?
Right.
I'm ready.
Excellent. So Mandy, while I'm giving you remote access to control the presentation, let me quickly introduce you so people will know who you are. So first of all, it is an honor and a privilege for me to introduce you. Mandy Andress, if you are not familiar with, she is the Chief Information Security Officer at Elastic for the last 6 years. Actually, I saw it. It will be 6 years in May. So 5 years and 5 years and 11 months. She is a global security leader for quite some time. She even lectured in universities. We are both villagers at Team 8. That's a respect for me, being a part of that one as well. She holds CISSP and also CPA, and she's a member of the Texas Bar, but we are not going to hold it against you, the last toast, those last two. So without further ado, Mandy, the stage is yours.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that awesome introduction. So hi, everyone. Pleased to join you today just to talk about what are some of the challenges that CISOs are facing in today's world. Get my slides. There you go. Already had a great introduction, so I think everyone knows who I am. So I will jump into the core of the content. Just a little bit of overview, what we're going to focus on today to start things out. Talk at a high level about some of the challenges that CISOs are facing, how the risk landscape is changing and evolving, what that means in day-to-day practices, and then how security and specifically the role of the CISO is also evolving into a much more strategic business role. And we'll touch on that, and then we'll pass it on to Yoad to talk through some specific context of the software supply chain securities. So to start, the landscape is quickly changing, and I often joke that I landed in security because I get bored very quickly, and I love to learn. And in security, if you're not learning new things every day, you're quickly falling behind. And that speed of change has only increased significantly over the past few years. Certainly, the breadth of technology, the complexity of technology environments and organizations, the global presence, able to allow threat actors to find more and more ways to gain access to information, gain access to money through things like ransomware. Phishing's been around forever, social engineering, and then starting to see much more focus on the software supply chain attacks. Things like SolarWinds really brought that into visibility. But doing some research with some of the current threat reports that have been published. So a few key things that are changing on the threat landscape is one, ransomware. So that continues to be a very significant issue, and we see a lot of that impacting organizations even over the past few months. And the dwell time for a ransomware, a couple of years ago, it was 9 days. It was 5 days last year. And most recently, it's down to usually at most 2 days, but often less than 24 hours. So you have very little time to react. So it's understanding, how do you know that something's happening in your environment or within your supply chain, and how do you take very, very quick action? Another key component is that in the past, malware, viruses were the core threat that we were facing. And last year, this is according to the CrowdStrike report, 75% of attacks that they saw did not include any malware. The focus is moving more and more to the identity. So we have API keys, secrets, account credentials, often aspects that are connecting you to the supply chain of an organization. And one of the key targets and issues there is if they're using valid credentials, it's very hard to detect if it's an unauthorized user using those credentials. And so we're starting to move into more behavior-focused analysis. So kind of bridging into emerging technologies. We do have the XC event that is going on from a supply chain perspective, and that's going to be a very interesting scenario to continue to see how that plays out and what we learned from that. So very sophisticated, very time-focused, very much a long game seems to have been happening in that space. Emerging technologies, of course, AI is the top topic on everyone's minds. And we see that, of course, being used by threat actors. You have Worm GPT that is focusing on malware, Fraud GPT, Darkbert is a GPT for the whole dark web, and starting to see essentially malware in GPTs. There's an example called The Thief, where you play tic-tac-toe and it's gathering your credentials and sending that information to a centralized point that's then being utilized. And as much as emerging technologies and all of the deep fakes that are becoming significantly more accurate and real, we saw the news on the $25 million fund transfer based on some deep fake videos with the CEO that happened a couple of months ago. Mentioned complexity early on, and that's helping the success of the emerging technologies. And how do you connect them all together? How do you combine some of the legacy technologies that are still in your environment with the emerging technologies that your business is adopting? And then looking ahead, space is a big issue, whether it's satellites and communication, and becoming more and more of a target just from how do you transfer information? How are you accessing and getting visibility? So seeing more and more of that, and a starting point is that as an emerging focus as well. Moving next into regulatory changes, we've seen, again, significant increases, more and more global regulatory changes and country-specific. So just a couple examples. In the EU recently, we have the AI requirements coming out, a Network Information Security Directive, a Data Governance Act, DORA, the Digital Operational Resilience Act, Data Act, the Cyber Resilience Act, new regulations in UK, Switzerland, Turkey, Australia, India, in the US, new disclosure rules for public companies. There's presidential executive orders, new public sector requirements. So all of that, wherever you look, there's more regulatory focus, and oftentimes, sometimes conflicting, or while regulations might not conflict, they may conflict with your organization's business practices. So that's driving a lot of focus and a lot of change. And sometimes moving away from a focus of security. So it's how do you balance all of that? So this is a day in the life of the CISO. No 2 days are ever the same. And to some extent, you never know what your day is going to look like. You'll have a plan, have at your calendar, your diary shows that you're doing, but you never know when that one thing, that phone call, that email, that Slack message is going to come up and change everything. So this graphic is a nice view of something called the CISO mind map. And if you Google that, this is a version that shows the complexity in all the different areas. And if you, again, Google that, the 2024 version was just released a few days ago. And if you go back over the last few years, you'll see that mind map growing and expanding, and the roles and responsibilities, the focuses of a CISO just continue to expand, and all the various components. So in the past, security leaders much more focused on policy and setting general architecture rules. How do we want to approach security? But now we're getting much more into business strategic roles. Risk management is now a significant component. We have strong security operations, so we understand what's happening in our large and complex environments. We're enabling the business. How do we balance the security and risk and enable the business to move quickly and continue to meet the objectives that they've defined? And so all of this continues to come together, and not to mention from our regulatory topic on the previous slide, just the legal aspects that have now been added into the CISO role. And so all of those components create a number of challenges. So I mentioned risk, and first and foremost in today's world, a CISO's job is to help a business manage their cyber risk. And risk will never be zero. We're never going to remove it. Say in the past, in the early days of information security in organizations, our goal was to remove all vulnerabilities, remove risk. We know in today's world that's not practical. It's how do you balance? How do you define as an organization what is the risk appetite that you're comfortable with? And then as a security leader, what are the things that you need to do to bring your organization to that level of risk that the company is willing to accept? And doing all of that when you have, back to the CISO mind map visual, all these different topics and all of these different areas that you need to focus on. You're just one individual, you have a team, never a team that's large enough, never enough budget. So having to make some really challenging decisions to balance all of those conflicting priorities and resources. So how do you operate in that world? And so, first and foremost, prioritize, continually prioritize. It's hard. It's very hard to look at everything that is being asked of you and making clear decisions on what's number one, what's number two, and in an environment where those priorities could change in an hour, in a minute. Your business strategy can change, an M&A acquisition could be announced, a new threat could be published that has a significant impact, a type of security event happens in your environment. So it's both prioritizing, but being flexible and understanding that those priorities can change quickly. And doing so in a way that has your team not feeling that you're just changing priorities all the time. And it's like a careful balance for that communication and that focus. And then doing that in a way that you're just utilizing every resource and tool that's available to you. Oftentimes, when we look at the scope of security tools we have in our environment or technology in general, we're not utilizing all of the capabilities and capacity that those tools provide. So I often comment that first, just look what's in your environment, focus on the fundamentals, focus on the basics, do that well, you're 80% there. And then looking at the existing tools that you have in your environment, using all the capabilities and all of the various features. And you'll go a very, very long way in understanding and protecting your overall environment. And within that, we continue to see a shift and a need to change our overall mindset as security leaders. And we see that referenced a lot in conversations that the CISO role is becoming more of a strategic business role. Security is now more strategic and business impacting, not just a technology risk. And changing that perspective for many security folks is moving from a very technical, often tactical approach to looking at what are the things I need to focus on? How does my business make money? How does my organization stay successful? And what are the aspects of security that could impact that most significantly? And then starting to use that as your starting point for your analysis, but then getting into more focused analysis on the activities that you're taking. And yes, I have an event. It could have a $5 million impact on revenue that we expect, but it'll cost us $10 million to implement it. So you're really starting to get into some of those ROI conversations. And we often comment that ROI on security is hard to prove. There's a lot of work that's happening to try to understand that, and public information on impacts that we're able to utilize to balance some of that. But it's really changing that conversation and that mindset from removing security vulnerabilities and issues to focusing on managing risk. And we see that more and more in the supply chain as that becomes a larger component of our overall environments. And we're having significant business impacts. If you look at oftentimes, the slide has a few of the kind of key historical events, and we look at them and we track them. And yeah, the stock price would dip for a little while, but it often recovered, and usually did recover, oftentimes increased over time. What we're seeing today is significant impacts that aren't necessarily reflected in things like revenue specifically or the stock price. It's more focused on the supply chain and the uses of third parties and how a business is operating to make its money. So if you look at recently in the US, MGM had an event where they were claiming a $100 million loss. And it's not so much the financial loss, but there was significant impact to their customers. They just weren't able to operate, and from a gambling perspective, that wasn't working. Folks staying at their hotels couldn't check in, couldn't check out. So we're seeing much more of a reputation impact. And then also in the US right now, there's the Change Health. If you're not familiar with that, Change Health is a subsidiary of a very large health organization in the US, and they have a significant centralized role in fulfilling payment processes. So 94% of US hospitals, an untold number of medical offices and clinics, run all of their often billing and revenue processes through that. So we're seeing now just the direct impact of that one organization, that people can't get their medications, doctors aren't able to pay their staff, clinics are having to close. So we're seeing the US federal government step in, and we're seeing the parent organization step in and try to provide loans to allow these businesses and these clinics to keep running successfully. And we're seeing a conservative estimate of a cost of $100 million a day. And so that, while it's a ransomware event, there are technology and system impacts. We're seeing a significant impact, at least across the US, and how that's changing people's lives and continually creating a broader impact than just what we've looked at in the past as a kind of single organization, revenue, stock price business. And within all of that, we're seeing it happen through that broader supply chain. And so looking at how do we try to better protect ourselves against these types of things. So I've talked a lot about the ever-shifting demands of security teams and security leaders. You need to be very, very vigilant, be able to be agile and quick and change when needed, but recognize when you need to stay the course as well. Security, not a one-time endeavor, an ongoing journey. We're never going to be fully secure. There's always going to be new technologies, new threats that we need to address. And so looking at it as, if I finish this project, we're going to be secure in this area. You might be for an hour, but things are going to evolve and change, and continuing to look at it as that journey and where should we go next. And with all of that, with the focus of threat actors today on supply chain, looking for API key secrets, really, really priority to focus on our software development practices and ensure that they're trustworthy, resilient, and protected. So I will now hand it over to Yoad to touch on that topic in more detail.
Excellent. Thanks. 1 second. So thank you, Mandy. And Yoad, before you start, we do have a few questions to you, Mandy. So Will Carroll asked, "Hi, Mandy. Not sure if you address in the presentation, but I'm interested if there are any major differences in the threat models between a software development company versus a company that does internal application development. I mentioned before a bank. So if your core business is developing, or your core business is something else, but you do have development teams internally, does that make a difference when it comes to building or setting up threat models for your company?"
I don't see a difference with whether software development is your core business, or in the example of a bank, it's not your core business, but you develop. And I say that because technology runs pretty much every organization, whether you're using third-party software that was developed by another organization or you're building your own software in-house, the threats are the same. And that leads to some of the ongoing conversations of buy versus build. If you're building your applications in-house, do you have the budget, the resources to make sure that you are developing those products as securely as possible, given that they're likely very significant and critical to the success of your business? So I don't see much difference there.
Another question is, how do you prioritize security measures within software development lifecycle, particularly in light of the evolving AI-based attacks?
First, understanding of, Will mentioned that the threat models, first and foremost, is understanding what potentially could happen in your overall software. So it's understanding the integrations. I think integration points within software components is one of the areas that are being targeted, and not something that we look at. So we'll do threat models in very niche specific areas, but we rarely take a step back and look at threat models across the broader interaction and integrations that are needed. So that would be one, and understand and really focusing on those integration points. Another would be building on just the secure development practices and working with your developers and ensuring that they have the education, the knowledge, the awareness, and ideally providing tools that help make that just a standard part of how they operate and being able to provide quick feedback. Then there's the ongoing, we talk about threat modeling, but things change, and moving threat modeling from being something that you're doing when you're first developing an application or when you're developing a new feature, but something that is happening more frequently. This is something where I see AI having the ability to be very, very helpful. I know there's some organizations out there that are developing tools, leveraging AI to do what we'll call micro threat models and do ongoing real-time threat models, understanding what's changing in the threat landscape and letting you know how that could impact your application. And then bringing all of that together, and from a software development lifecycle, having ways that you can understand more broadly what's happening in the overall dependencies. So a lot of organizations are using third-party code libraries, open source tools, and having the visibility and knowledge of what that is, what's in your environment, exactly what you're using, and impacts of new CVEs that come out is another key aspect of that as well, having the visibility and tools to help with that.
Mm-hmm. Another question from Vioma Hargonkar. I hope that I read it rightly. And I assume that's a security engineer, because the question is for a tip for a security engineer. So could you please suggest on how to keep up with all the latest threats and attacks happening out there every day as a security engineer?
It's almost impossible to stay up to date with absolutely everything that's happening. My recommendation is to focus day to day on the core fundamentals. Ensure that from a development practice, you are focusing your development on coding securely as it's defined in your organization and the coding language, development language that you're utilizing. Continuing to follow strong security practices of being mindful of what you're putting in logs. Don't use hard-coded secrets and use more just-in-time access, authentication, least privilege. If you're focusing on those core fundamentals, when there's a new threat, oftentimes you will at least slow down the potential for success. And what that does, it allows you to be able to focus on those very, very critical events that happen. And those are the ones that that have the noise, they have the press, they have the conversations. They're the ones that you'll hear about very quickly and will know to focus on. But you can build some trust and you can build some strength in your overall process and being able to really, as I said before, focus on those fundamentals.
Mm-hmm. Another question is more tends to the software supply chain, which is again not become a thing. It's already a thing for quite some time. Is how do you? Do you? Okay, it's a bit weird. So, do you consider external development contractors as supply chain potential attackers, or do you see them as part of your supply chain, or contractors are the same as employees?
I don't see contractors the same as employees, but I see that from a perspective of kind of employment status in the organization. I don't, when there's a developer, whether it's an internal employee developer or a third-party contractor, I don't look at doing anything different. If I have strong security processes and practices built into my software development lifecycle, I continue to follow those. So doing peer code reviews, running source code analysis, dynamic analysis, and just having an understanding of what's happening in your organization. That being said, there are kind of employment practices with contractors where possible, geographically, doing background checks and ensuring that we are hiring trustworthy individuals, but the same goes for hiring employees as well. So my focus is on ensuring that we have strong software development lifecycle processes, and then that makes the focus on individuals and having different processes for different people, which is hard to maintain and sustain, not quite as critical.
Okay. Another question by Gil Levy. Given the challenges that we spoke, what help will you look in a third-party solution? Is the way you are evaluating these tools changed accordingly?
So I've interpreted the question of just what do I look for in tools to help solve all of these challenges that we discussed in lifecycle?
If those things changed due to the new challenges. So basically, did the list of expectations from third-party solutions change and evolve due to the challenges that we spoke about?
Ah, thank you for the clarification. I think I understand it now.
I assume you're trying to also understand.
I think expectations changed from the context that we're expecting tools to provide more information and guidance, kind of defining that and providing more values to developers or the end users, if it's more in the CI/CD components of a development lifecycle. And I say that because there's such a focus on, minimal resources in an organization, need to develop, get out the products, get out the new features. And security is important, but we need to, again, find that balance on continuing to move things forward. And so looking at tools that can both identify potential issues within the code, within the development lifecycle, and then be able to recommend actions. And if an organization is comfortable taking automatic actions to address things. So just that ongoing personal interaction, resource requirements to support and maintain are continuing to be less and less. And those are the areas that I think we focus on more now than we did before based on the changing threat landscape.
Excellent. Okay, so I have one more question that we'll wait for it for the, it seems like it's going to be answered in Yoad's presentation. So thank you a lot, Mandy. And Yoad, while I'm giving you access to control remotely my computer and go through the slides, let me maybe introduce you to the audience.